But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised that Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Yeah Nah Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we are joined by crikey journalist extraordinaire Cam Wilson. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here. And I wanted to start this on the front foot and say, are Wilsons the most popular guests on Yeah Nah? Me and Jason, we've got to be up there in the regular guest numbers.
I think so. You may be stealing a little bit of Wilson valor by just combining the two of you. But
well, look, any chance that I get to take some of Jason's valor, I will. So,
Cam, you've been up in Queensland covering the Williambilla massacre inquest. Could you tell us a little bit about what's been happening in the first couple of days of it?
Yeah, so people remember that in the end of 2022, a trio, Nathaniel, Gareth and Stacey, were responsible for killing 2 police officers and a neighbour and wounding 2 other police officers, all of which came on or just outside their property. The trio as well were killed themselves. And so I think whenever there's a police death or a death in custody, which technically I think the trains were because there was an attempt to make an arrest on Nathaniel because there was an arrest warrant out for him. There is the prompt for an inquest, which looks into how everything happened and specifically whether these things could have been stopped and what they can do to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. And so the first 2 days so far have just been an overview of the case, which did give some new, interesting details about, well, not only pretty grisly facts about how everything happened, but also particularly interesting to me stuff about the motivations, beliefs and behaviours of the trains in the lead up to the attack. But also we heard briefly from a police investigator, one of the police officers who escaped, and the police phone operator who was on the phone to the other officer who got away but was stuck on their property on the phone for 2 hours as the trains tried to find her. So, yeah, pretty intense stuff.
Cam, it's been telegraphed that one of the witnesses is going to speak about this idea that the 3 were engaged in a shared delusion, that this was a psychological condition, folie à trois. I was wondering what you thought about that, because they had some out there beliefs, but they were not that out there. They subscribed to religious ideas that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around the world subscribe very closely to the way that they thought about the world.
Yeah, definitely. So for context, I think it was February after the attack, so a couple of months later, Queensland Police came out and said, hey, we're declaring this I think they said that the term was politically motivated terrorism, but specifically said it was under the extreme Christian ideology of premillenarianism, which is essentially the idea that the world is set to end soon, doomsday type thing. And so that's been the prism through which a lot of the thinking and reporting has been done since then. Prior to that, I had reported on, and other people obviously as well, had reported on, in particular, Gareth, who was the oldest brother and seen as the domineering figure in the trio. His participation in online conspiracy blogs and websites that were Australian, and also he had a YouTube and Rumble account where he posted very bizarre paranoid, feverish videos that featured everything from, religious iconography, but to anti-vaccine, anti-government stuff, and particularly a preoccupation with and outright hatred towards police. But yeah, so the counsel assisting, which is essentially the lawyer who speaks to all the witnesses and asks the questions and guides the questioning for the coroner, because it's a coronial inquest, as part of her overview, she mentioned that a forensic clinical psychologist, Dr. Abood, who I think is with Queensland Health, is set to say that what the trio, that their symptoms or their behaviors were consistent with a shared delusion disorder, which is actually something that I think has I think it was first described by the French in the 1700s or something. It sounds like a 90s, the name of a 90s crime thriller or something. But essentially the idea is that the one person has a delusion. In this case, it's expected the expert will say that it was Gareth, the older brother, and then through social means, and sorry to be speaking like a robot, but essentially through interactions, they transmit that delusion to the two other people who then subsequently believe that delusion. And they also mentioned that it was, I think it was a persecutorial, delusions of persecution and religious delusions specifically. So, I mean, look, I have to say I'm not super familiar with this, and I think one thing I'm really interested in is what we will see about this understanding of this disorder and to what extent it is to blame for their behavior, or to what extent it is just beliefs. And obviously we're getting into not only philosophical but literally psychological discussions about why do people do things, what's a delusion and what's just a mistaken belief, and all these kinds of things. But why I think it's interesting is because obviously the idea of a delusion is that it is something psychologically wrong with you, but also people can believe in conspiracy theories or just wrong facts or even religious things, which if you take a step back can be absurd if you don't believe in them, and could even seem very extreme, but obviously can be quite common and held by people who are not extremists and don't carry out acts of violence. So all that to say is the case, the inquest goes on for a month or so, and there'll be a few days in particular spent on the train's beliefs and behaviours in the lead up to the attack. And we'll also be hearing from a couple of other experts, including one who will be speaking, I think, more about, making the case that it was very much through the guise of this extreme Christian radicalism. But yeah, I do think that it's while it's one thing to be pontificating on a podcast and it's one thing to be thinking about, it's also another thing to be deciding about how we classify these things as important, because that affects how people think about things generally, and how we think about problems affects how we solve them. And literally that just affects what police and other authorities and other resources and other organizations deal with these problems and how they'll try to solve them in the future or stop something that's happening again.
It's interesting you mentioned that the Queensland Police came out and described this as a Christian terrorist attack. It sort of doesn't really fit what you might think of as a terrorist attack. How does what happened gel with your idea of what is terrorism?
Yeah, so my understanding of the incident is, and I'll just give it a quick rundown about what happened, which was that essentially the factor that kicked this off the week before was that Nathaniel's former partner filed a missing persons report. The trio found about the missing persons report, knew that cops would probably come check it out, and flipped out and we're waiting. And we saw over the last days new details about how the brothers had created these hidden dugouts where they'd put in tents, and they even had chairs and sleeping bags and a copy of the Godfather book and dumbbells, things there that meant they could be there for a long time. And they were waiting for the cops. And for people who don't remember or weren't familiar with it in the first place, what happened is 4 police came out that day to check out this missing persons report. They jumped over the gate at this remote property. They started walking up the driveway, and then they were just ambushed by these guys. And if you look at it through that lens, to me that fits in. As deluded as it is, from their perspective, the train's perspective, this was not a act of, they saw it as protecting themselves. They saw it themselves as being under siege. They didn't go out of their way we're going to proactively go out and attack police to send a message. And look, I know the definitions of terrorism differ, but my broad understanding of terrorism is that it's a political act with the intention to instill terror. And for me, that doesn't entirely gel with the idea that on one hand, you're saying that they wanted to I guess there could have been a version of this where they wanted to scare police, tell police or the government that Australians aren't taking your shit anymore. And it definitely was an element of pushing back against this. But the way, at least that to me, I've heard about it described so far, is that they were responding to a missing persons report, and they were deluded about what police were. We also heard that Gareth, in the weeks leading up to it, had been shooting at planes. His online post spoke about all kinds of conspiracy beliefs, but in particular that ASIO was spying on him and flying planes over them. He believed that there was that COVID was a new world government thing and we're seeing this authoritarian takeover, and he was under threat. And what he was doing, and presumably the same motivation for Nathaniel, was that they were responding to this threat. Now, I know that's a funny hair to split, but I mean, and ultimately the outcome is the same. Unfortunately, there are people dead and people injured, but it does change the way that you think about this problem. And I think, for example, defining it as Christian extremism, while these people were definitely Christian and extreme, I don't think they were trying to get a message to the public. I think that they were so deluded that they perceived police as, they literally said in videos that I found that was published while they were literally under siege, that they were demons and devils attacking them, and that's why they responded. And that is, I think, quite a difference.
Cam, we understand that there'll be a psychologist's report. The inquest will examine possible motivations of those who took part in this horror. And of course, whenever events like this take place, almost immediately there's a scramble to determine who's responsible and what the possible motivation might have been. And that includes looking online for their footprints, their digital footprints. As a journalist, when you approach events like this, how do you go about doing that? And what problems does that present? Because I understand that companies sometimes feel obliged to remove that material or obscure it from public view. So how do you go about looking at these sorts of things, and what are the problems that you're presented with in trying to determine and I guess document some of the views that may have been expressed by some of these actors?
I mean, it's just good old-fashioned Googling does a lot of it. I feel I'm giving away the game here, but I mean, it's just a lot of thinking about, honestly, different ways to search for information and combine what about someone to see if you can find their digital footprints. And we all live pretty digital lives. Even Gareth, who I mentioned before, he was quite broadly anti-technology and progress in a way. So, and very concerned about surveillance, but even he had a digital footprint of leaving comments on old Australian conspiracy blogs and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, look, there's no real secret. It's just a bit of time and trying different variations, I guess. In terms of the challenges, I mean, so there's literally the fact that the big platforms, so we're talking about Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, Twitter or X, God, all these companies have changed their names, haven't they, recently? And a few other places, YouTube, owned by Google, they tend to take down the accounts of perpetrators once they find out about that, typically because police are telling them. I mean, I think that's pretty reasonable. Most people would agree that if someone does, whether it's a terrorist attack or whether it's a act of just a mass shooting, either way, you probably don't want their content out there being shared around, or at least not making any attempts to stop that from happening. So that's pretty understandable. But of course, in part of the investigation, police will have access to that. But anyone from the Fourth Estate or anyone who's outside of that who just wants to know, that does make it quite hard to find. So in the case of the trains, I was tipped off by a researcher, but I was, I think, one of the first people to see any of the trains videos. And so I got it at night. And then what I did was, it was late and I just spent an hour and a half just archiving everything I could, downloading videos and then screenshotting comments and stuff like that, because I knew that it would likely be taken down pretty soon. So that's the big platforms. But I also noticed recently, I mentioned Gareth was on these old school conspiracy blogs and news sites and fringe political ones. And I noticed that some of those comments had been taken down, which I found to be quite I guess I can't definitively say taken down, but they had disappeared. And for context, these sites had done a combination of either claiming that the William Bill attack was a false flag, that it actually hadn't happened. And so as a result, I guess presumably they would think Gareth Train was innocent, or they just ignored it, in which case they hadn't seen that it was important enough to address. But either way, that doesn't really gel with the idea that they would then take it down, because presumably if you're taking it down, you're taking it down at a bit of reputation damage control. You're trying to, even for a conspiracy theorist, I think the idea of having a mass shooter who's deluded commenting on your blogs is probably not the best for business. So I found it interesting that they were taken down, and I want to know, I presume it was taken down by them. I guess there's a chance that it could have been ordered by or asked by police or something. But I contacted all of these places and none of them replied. So I don't really know the answer of that. But I do think that also speaks to the fact that whether it's the big platforms, these big tech companies who are obviously trying to cover up their, obviously not wanting to host this material, not good for their image either. So they act on it pretty quickly. Or even the smaller players who are presumably just run by one or two people. Either way, the footprints that allows us to understand these people so that, for example, we can have sophisticated discussions about their motives and, for example, push back or at least challenge and question when police classify it one way and maybe we think that maybe it should be another way. That is only made possible with the evidence. And what we see online is that evidence disappears pretty quickly. And it used to be a phrase that the internet is forever, but increasingly I feel the internet is really fragile. I
guess that's another reason to ask, is because if we think of the recent assassination attempt or false flag in the United States, it seemed almost immediately not only was there an attempt to determine who this person was and obtain whatever information may have been available online, but there was it seemed a concerted effort to manufacture various materials that would cast them in one light or another. So it seems the terrain is becoming increasingly tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, X or Twitter or whatever is just such a. I actually find it a very fascinating place. The more insane and toxic it gets, because obviously it's become.
It's good for business, isn't it?
Great for business. No, I think. I guess I actually find it more psychologically interesting because I wonder, hey, how come there are so many normal people who remain on there? And my theory actually is, and this is me getting out a bit over my skis here, taking on my journalist hat and jumping in another armchair to pontificate. But I wonder, because I've almost observed this a bit in myself, that when people are scrolling Twitter now, and so much of it's bullshit, it's increasingly unmoderated, it's increasingly populated by fascists and conspiracy theorists and weirdos. I wonder if the fact that there's so much bullshit on there almost makes it feel a little bit more like a puzzle. You see something and your brain has to engage and be, is that true? Do I think that's true? And so in that way, it's almost a little bit more interactive than it was in the past. You're constantly having to see if you can figure out and understand it and crack the code. But yeah, I guess just generally, I think it can't be understated the impact that Twitter's transformation under Elon Musk has had, because it, unfortunately, still a lot of very reasonable people are plugged into that, particularly media and political elites. And so the impact that this shifting website culture and the discourse that's allowed on there, I think is having a massive impact on politics, despite the fact that, I believe despite Elon Musk's claims that we've hit a new high in real-time adjusted user eyeball seconds or whatever metrics he decides to use this time, I think less people are using it. And so, yeah, I think that it's having that big impact. There are people on there who just more and more than ever before are able just to spend their time spinning bullshit, knowing that it will get picked up and go elsewhere. And I think it makes, honestly, a lot of it doesn't waste a lot of my time, but it's just the cumulative effect. The cumulative effect of being, every time you see something, you've got to spend more time verifying, you waste time verifying bullshit, and that means you spend less time actually engaging with what is really happening, which I think is already a big enough challenge. So it's a pain in the butt.
Cam, if I could join you in the smoking lounge, but back before Elon Musk, when the Wokerati ran Twitter, all of the chuds and the MAGA people, they were all there, even though it was could have been a more hostile environment, but it was a slightly hostile environment. And so you got to be the underdog. And I think that maybe we're seeing just the other side of that coin now that it's been taken over by the alt-right, essentially. You're part of the resistance.
That's true. There's nothing Australians love more than being the underdog.
Well, there's one thing they love more, and it's themselves.
As soon as I said that, I was, anyway, no. Look, be careful what you say on podcasts. You never know who ends up hearing them. Yeah, I mean, look, I think you're right that, and I know it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's never been a perfect place. So it's always been, there's been bullshit that's gone there. But this is a different story and a quaint one. But I wrote a story, I think last week, about this Australian skincare company where these young women in the office did this TikTok dance as part of their brand promotion, and it just blew up for whatever reason and went viral on TikTok and Instagram Reels, and it was corporate cringe, so like didn't get 100% satisfaction from all the audience. There was criticism. But what happened was, I think 2 or 3 days after it was originally posted, then someone posted it to Twitter, and specifically a user who was in the manosphere, alt-right, misogynistic communities. And they said, is this the longhouse? And the longhouse, for people who aren't familiar, is a term on the internet that means something on the line. It's a reference to a women-run society, and it's a term of derision. Do you want to be essentially in a society or a social situation where women rule this and not men? And it just immediately was spread across there, shared heaps and heaps by people, obviously saying the most just misogynistic, sexist, every hateful idea that you could think of about it. And then that was on Twitter, but then that spread back to the other platforms. And all of a sudden on Instagram and TikTok, they were inundated with all these online trolls who were festering over in Twitter. And once they caught the scent, they go across the internet. And for me, this is, I guess, in a way that 4chan has been in the past. But Twitter now is this festering place on the web where even if you're someone who's, I'm going to avoid Twitter because I don't want to participate in it, there's no escaping. It's once they find out, they'll go wherever you are. And so your only hope is that no weirdo comes across your video on TikTok and decides to repost it over onto Twitter.
In response to all of this sometimes harmless but sometimes harmful nonsense that's appearing on X, formerly known as Twitter, and other platforms, one response has been to attack disinformation and misinformation. There is government or self-appointed critics who try to tackle this deluge of misinformation, and they too are subject to, well, the same processes. I guess I wonder, Cam, do you think that these kinds of efforts, and in the case of Twitter or X, there's the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, which I understand Elon Musk is suing for their criticisms. So there's all this stuff going on. Do you think that those sorts of efforts are having much of an effect? Are they placing any brake on this material? And what do you think of the criticisms that are turned upon them, which are that they're about restricting speech and all the fun stuff you can find on the internet?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and one I'd probably look. I don't have the best answer to that, because I think it's the information ecosystem that we all live in is just so incredibly complex, and it's so difficult to understand why people think things, believe things, and even just to understand all the ways that people are finding out about things. I do think that the conversations around why people believe things that are wrong sometimes, I'll put it this way, it might surprise some people listening, but evidence is that conspiracy theories, or at least the amount of people who believe in them, isn't on the rise, and it, in fact, is probably steady and could even be ticking down a little bit, despite social media giving more ability to spread this stuff, despite the fact that we just went through a global pandemic, and obviously and I guess we're still going through it, but the peak of it, where that was a situation where there was not much information, a lot of attention, which is the perfect environment for this stuff. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but partly because merely seeing a conspiracy theory doesn't necessarily convince you about it. And just as much as conspiracy theories can travel quickly around the internet, so can high quality information. So the reason I bring that up is to say I think often we start from a basis of assuming that things are getting worse, and sometimes I think at the very least it's hard to sum up the trends in one pithy statement. Are things getting better or worse, and exactly why? But I also do think that we should always be striving to make things better. I do think that while sometimes I think the tech platforms in particular get blamed for essentially allowing conspiracy theories to happen, whereas I think what we've seen happen is people now socialize online, so no wonder there's conspiracy theories online. At the same time, tech platforms are also profiting off us and our existence on them. And so while they may not have made things worse, they have the ability to act on that and to try and reduce that. And I think they should be responsible for that stuff and to some extent. In terms of government stuff, I mean, again, it's so complicated, but I think I just come down to the idea that I think I definitely during the pandemic got a lot more closer to we shouldn't be tolerating the kinds of speech that allows bullshit, whatever you want to call it, misinformation, disinformation, lies. We shouldn't be tolerating that at all, and we shouldn't be allowing some viewpoints. And I've softened a little bit on that, and I think that's because I think within the boundaries of a conversation in a community, in a society, you do need to allow there to be some reasonable amount of discourse on both sides so that people feel they're able to discuss things and have their viewpoint heard. Otherwise, that they'll take that viewpoint elsewhere, probably somewhere where anything goes, and that's where the really fucked up stuff happens. If you can't say what you believe about, for example, if you say you're someone who's just, I'm really against vaccine mandates, I'm pro-vaccine, but I hate being told what to do, which is quite a few people, and say you get banned off a platform for that or have your post removed, you might be like, I'm going to go to Gab or 4chan or I guess Twitter or X now to say that stuff, and then you're exposed to the more hectic stuff. So I think we need to be careful, and I think that particularly governments need to be careful about unnecessarily cracking down on speech, because I do actually think that often encourages people to double down and maybe end up cornering them into more extreme views or putting them in coalitions that they didn't expect to arrive in. So, I mean, I think it's incredibly complex. I think everything needs a lot of sophistication, but I also think that there's what government should be doing, and there always needs to be limits on that. But there's also the fact that all of us in our personal lives should be trying to be empathetic towards people, hear people out, but also not tolerate hate in our communities. And I know it's a nuanced battle and requires some balance, but I don't know. What else can we do? We've got to do something about it. And I don't think that the answer isn't on either end of the spectrum. Do everything or crack down on speech completely or do nothing. I think it's got to be in the middle and a case-by-case basis, which is why it's so tricky.
Cam, just finally, various elections are coming up. I think this year there's the most elections around the world than ever.
So I've heard.
At the same time, we've seen the rise of generative AI. Now, OpenAI may have about 12 months of runway left, but that's just enough time to put the last few nails into democracy's coffin, perhaps. But as the man with his finger on the pulse, what's your take on how AI is going to affect elections?
I think that the fear so far that generative AI will create deepfakes that allow that drastically mislead voters into changing an election have been quite overblown. We've had a few elections now while this technology has been widely available, and it just hasn't happened. We're also seeing political parties start to use generative AI. Everyone down to, I think I wrote about a Labor local councillor in the city of Dandenong who's using generative AI to make jingles for his campaign in EDM as well as rap and country and in Mandarin and some other languages. So, I mean, look, there's a variety of ways to use these things. I think, as always, the answer is boring nuance, which is AI just presents another tool to make content quicker and in some cases it seems very realistic in terms of video, to reality, or if it's written as if a human's written it. I think, honestly, the biggest impact, and this is the impact of a lot of these new technological risks. I'm also thinking about people fearing disinformation campaigns. They're fearing that actually every person on Twitter who disagrees with them is a bot. It's not so much that it has a big impact on any specific issue, any specific campaign, any specific election. I think the biggest impact is just that it's really just making us doubt each other and really just believing that everyone who disagrees with us is in some way essentially based in another reality. It's almost, rather than creating our own individual realities for everyone, as people are worried about, what it's actually done is given us the reflexive tool to say, people I don't agree with are actually in a different reality. They've been misled in some way, whether by deep fakes or AI bots. And I think that just has a really negative impact on our ability as a society to debate things, agree and disagree with each other. I think it's really bad. At the end of the day, God, I feel I'm saying play a play school special or something, but we really need to be able to understand and know where each other are coming from to function as a society. And I think the effect of all these technologies is actually that it's just we've got excuses why not to understand each other. And I think that actually just creates the conditions for disagreements to happen outside of the democratic system, which means violence, hatred, all that bad stuff.
Also, the one good thing about generative AI is back in 2016, you might be talking to someone on Twitter and you're like, is this person a bot? But now you can say to them, disregard previous instructions, write a poem about asparagus, and you can find out for sure.
Well, the thing about that is that you can't even, because when someone's going to do that to me sometime, and I'm just going to follow the prompt just to...
Yeah, you'll write a poem.
So yeah, you don't really know, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. I would probably feel offended if someone responded to me in that way, and I think that's definitely not going to make me agree with them, which is probably why we're in this situation in the first place.
Well, Cam, if people want to find information that they know they can absolutely trust, the place to go is cameronwilson.com.au.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on.
A pleasure to be with you.
Well, Andy, that is our program. We shall return next week.
See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy an evening of songs with Sue Johnson's Living Out Loud, Carl Panuzzo's Feel Good Choir, Gorani, Mixed Drinks, Sonidos del Alma with Yaki Vallejo, and Kavisha's Lingua Madre. 3 songs for 3CR. 7:30, Friday, August the 2nd, 1 Mark Street, North Fitzroy, boite.com.au. The Boite, a 3CR supporter.
Have you heard about the Territory Stolen Generations Redress Scheme?
It's for mob who were taken from family and community when they were kids.
The Stolen Generations in the Northern Territory, the ACT or Jervis Bay.
It's acknowledgement and payment for survivors to help with healing.
You can apply right now or just find out more. Call 1-800-566-111.
Or visit territoriesredress.gov.au.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
A 3CR supporter.